we actually go way back, and Ambassador Kocher and I served in Budapest as the ambassador, Slovak ambassador, and me the US ambassador. So this is quite a reunion here, all being together. So really delighted to be here.
I should point out, Colleen, I think
please.
to start that when Colleen Bell was nominated to be the US ambassador to Hungary, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary who was in charge of Central Europe at that time. And I had the great fortune of getting to know you as you prepped for your hearings.
That's right.
And I knew it was going to be a great run, and we've kept in touch since, because I have a great passion for Budapest in particular, but for the region at large. And it's just great to see you still involved through the Atlantic Council with the region, with Hungary, and bringing these ideas plus your background, particularly the influences of popular culture. I think it's very timely.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much. As Damon mentioned, I'm working for Governor Gavin Newsom at the time. I run the agency for television and film for the state, but I am here today as a former U.S. ambassador and a proud member of the Atlantic Council board. So it's really terrific to be here with you, Assistant Secretary Reeker. I'll just give you a bit of background on Assistant Secretary Reeker, who has been serving in this position since March 18th. Prior to that, he was at US-EU Comms, Civilian Deputy and POLAD. He was a Consul General in Milan, DAS for EUR, as you mentioned. He was the ambassador to Macedonia, and he was the DCM in Budapest. He received many, many awards, but one that I find so fitting for a Phil ambassador, assistant, is the Robert C. Fraser Award for his commitment to peace and alleviation of human suffering caused by war and injustice. So it's really terrific to be here with you. And yes, when Ambassador Reeker was serving as DAS, he and I worked together in preparation. And when he went off then to serve as Consul General, the truth is, and you're all hearing this for the first time, I would occasionally call him. I had so much respect for him. He was an honored advisor, and I was very grateful for all of the depth of knowledge and the wealth of knowledge he shared with me. So it's terrific to be here again. So we're all here today, as you know, to gain a better understanding of the strategic importance of Central Europe as partners in trade, in security, and also, importantly, the defense of democracy. We're also here to discuss the future of U.S. Central European relations, both the domestic challenges and the challenge in transatlantic relationships, and for some Central European countries, an improvement, or what they deem as an improvement in their relations with the United States. And we'll get back to that. But I guess the first broad question that I'd like to direct today would be, where do you see the state of U.S. Central Europe relations? What is currently working, do you think, and what could be improved upon?
That's a great way to start. Let me first say, thank you for the invitation. It's always great to come to the Atlantic Council. Damon Wilson and I have dealt with these issues for many, many years. When I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Budapest and he was at the NSC, we planned a visit of President Bush, a short window. I think we had a week to pull the visit together, and it was an extraordinary event commemorating the 1956 uprising in Budapest. And that for me was a great cap of a long relationship with Hungary and with Budapest. I just came back from the region over the weekend. I travel about 1 week out of 2. And a lot of that time, since I took over as Assistant Secretary in the European Bureau, has been focused on Central Europe. And that is a priority for Secretary Pompeo, and it's a priority that came from my predecessor, Wes Mitchell, who was Assistant Secretary for about 15 months. I started at U.S. European Command about the same time he came on board at the European Bureau, and we had known each other through the rubric of Central European issues here in Washington, his work at SIPA, and we were able to sort of continue that conversation, and we ensured that our European command, from the civilian side in particular, was very knitted up with the State Department in a real state defense integration, so that we were on the same page and working in the same direction. And that focus on Central Europe was a big part of that. I think we have very good, solid relations with Central Europe, and we're particularly focused on this anniversary year that Damon outlined, because I do think it's important to put in a historical context where Central Europe and all of Europe have come from in the past century, since the end of World War I, and to understand how that history has affected them, and particularly in the last 30 years since 1989. As just a matter of context, I was a young graduate student in 1989 living in Berlin, studying German. And on a particular weekend in October, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, I decided I would take a trip to Budapest. It was kind of the thing to do at that stage. It was still the Iron Curtain. It was still the Soviet Union on the other side of that wall. But I went down to Budapest. There was a lot of concern what might happen. There had been a lot roiling. They had opened, of course, the barbed wire symbolically between Hungary and Austria. And it turned out to be the weekend of October 23rd, 1989, when, as I stood amongst this crowd, not understanding a word of Hungarian, they declared themselves no longer the People's Republic of Hungary, but the Republic of Hungary, before the Parliament House in Kossuth Square. And I didn't realize then the symbolism, but you could feel the energy and what this meant. And for me, coming from a family, I have a Hungarian grandfather, this was particularly symbolic and really changed a little bit the direction of my own career and interests. I see a lot of young people here, which I think is terrific. And I really want to commend the Atlantic Council for doing so much to reach out to younger generations who need to understand the context of where we are today, the history of the 20th century. And the changes, the tremendous changes that took place 30 years ago that we are only, in some ways now, really understanding. So we have set about at State to make sure that we are engaging Central Europe, and we often use that as shorthand for the Visegrad countries, but even more broadly, as allies and partners, as countries, one and all, in NATO and members of the European Union, which are direct results of the policies that we undertook in the era after 1989. Something that was an unexpected change. Nobody was predicting the Berlin Wall would fall in November. Maybe Dan Fried was, but he didn't have the date right. I think Dan said it would be November 17th. But I think that is broadly a success story, and there are ups and downs that, of course, get focused on with different trends, with different administrations on both sides of the Atlantic. But the fundamental fact is we pursued a Europe whole, free, strong, and at peace, integrated into transatlantic institutions, and that's what we've got.
So after 1989, you have the countries who are moving towards democracy and free market, and they have made these choices to join multilateral organizations, okay, in the pursuit of being a part of the global community in these meaningful ways. The alliances that they've chosen to join are, for instance, NATO, are not just a security alliance, but also values-based alliance. Well, we've been hearing recently about a lot of the successes of these countries, economic successes in terms of and otherwise. But there's also a lot of conversation about democracy, about the possibility of erosion of democracy in some of these countries. And as you mentioned, they are partners, and particularly members of NATO. We rely on them. What would you like to, can you share a little bit of insight into this? I mean, recognizing that not all democracies need to look alike. There need to there has to be pluralism within democracies, but the core inherent values of and principles of democracy, they need to be present in order for countries to be the best partners that they possibly can be, particularly as partners in security.
No, I think it's really good to step back and look at that. And in the road to NATO enlargement and membership for these countries, there was a real focus on the fact that NATO is not just a military alliance, it is an alliance of values, like a family in many ways. As these countries worked quite diligently to meet the requirements to undertake the reforms necessary to become members of NATO, that was always an important part of that, establishing a rule of law, fundamentals of democracy, focus on independent media, independent judiciary, of course good relations with neighbors, no outstanding issues. And we see that as NATO has continued to expand, now ready to take in its 30th member, North Macedonia, probably by the end of this year as the confirmation process keeps going among all the other allies. And so we share a basic set of values, and I believe that is still very much the case. But as in any family, individuals change, they go through different experiences, and we have to be able to talk about those things. That's why in the past year we undertook what we call the policy of principled engagement. There is no question that relations with some of our NATO allies in Central Europe, Hungary is an obvious example, had become strained and tense, and that wasn't something that was accomplishing anything on either side of the relationship, nor benefiting the alliance. And so we undertook to reevaluate and take a new look at how we would engage. And Secretary Pompeo has carried on with that, not only in terms of his statements, but also his actions in terms of going to these countries. He has visited the countries of Central Europe. Their leaders have been here, received at the White House, so that we can have frank conversations. We can have nice meetings that underscore the shared history we have, the shared values. These are all countries that have diaspora communities in the United States, which are proud of them. We're NATO allies who have done a lot together in the years since they have joined, whether it's in the Balkans or further afield. And we can have real conversations where we raise issues. As Secretary Pompeo says, engagement is key. Criticism is all right, but criticism without engagement is estrangement, and that's not the goal of any of us. And so that's what we're undertaking.
It's interesting that you say that too, and the principled engagement, and I agree. And I also believe that as a representative of the Obama administration, that we too had principled engagement, different than what's happening right now, but principled engagement. That being said, we continue to work on our commercial and economic cooperation, law enforcement, military cooperation, and otherwise, yet at the same time did have those very, very difficult conversations that were necessary to have. And actually, since that time, it's quite extraordinary how so much has shifted kind of in the world geopolitically. I mean, since the time I started in Budapest, it was the largest migration crisis since World War II, Brexit, attempted coup in Turkey. And that's something I'd love to kind of hear a bit about our engagement with Turkey in a bit after that. But it's challenging, and I do believe that there is a sense that some Central European countries felt that we had not given them the attention that they needed. And I think that there's probably some truth to that. There was a lot happening at the world at that time, but it continues, to lay out in front of us. So the importance of working together and have trusted allies has never been kind of more important, but again, rooted in those principles that unite all of us together. some of the issues that we're working on right now, we have, you know, an ascendant China, a Russia that's flexing its muscles and showing more influence in some of these countries than we would like. We have forces of autocracy versus democracy, and the geopolitical challenge that is underlying these tensions. We also have an overlay of global challenges. And I think that there are kind of 10 critical areas of global challenges that we will need to work with our Central European partners on. And you know, they include, you know, preventing nuclear proliferation, managing the global economy, adapting and mitigating climate change, advancing development, promoting global health, expanding global trade, cyber governance, transnational terrorism, etc. How do you see moving forward the United States working with Central Europe, our European partners together on these issues?
I think your point is exactly right. The agenda is long. There are great challenges. There were great challenges in 1989 in those countries. I mean, I think I often say to Western European allies and friends, and you know, to our own countrymen, if you had asked anyone in 1945 or 1947, standing in Europe, I lived in northern Italy for 3 years, which was not a hardship. But if you'd asked people in 1945 to look around and imagine that 70 years later we would live, they would live to the standards, to have the prosperity that they do, no one would have believed you at that time. And that's because of what we did, and the United States had a big role in that, but what we all did together in the post-war era of creating a set of institutions, the NATO alliance, setting about on the road to European integration, and creating what has become the EU. And that's despite ups and downs, transatlantic disagreements and arguments, economic crises now and again, changes in governments and parties. All of that is part of a continuum. And in 1989, we added a whole new chapter to that, 30 years ago, when the wall came down and suddenly we had the opportunity to work with countries with new governments, peoples who had been suppressed during the era of the Cold War by, in some cases, Soviet militaries, certainly by communism, and U.S. assistance poured in with the help of Western European countries as well, of course, and the economic success of those countries in Central Europe, and increasingly, even if you look at the countries in the Balkans who are still undergoing that transformation, it's enormous progress. It's never as much as people want. New generations come along and forget what was and learn to expect more. We live in an era of overwhelming amounts of information. And as you said, we are, as our national security strategy says, we are in an era of great power competition, which has reemerged. It's different types of competition. It's not the same military threat that U.S. European Command and NATO faced before the end of the Cold War. Now it's a very different type of threat with hybrid challenges, with cyber warfare, with the disinformation problems that Russia presents, and with China, which is a country that comes inextricably linked with its own Communist Party and a very different set of fundamental values from what we share in the transatlantic space. So those are all challenges that we have to work through, and that's why our alliance and why our partnerships and our engagement is so critical. Even when we have disagreements, even when we express concern about development in each other's countries. I've had a diplomatic colleague talk to me about being tired of being criticized in the Central European space, and I said, criticized? You're talking to an American diplomat. I mean, you want to learn about being criticized. That's what we do for a living. We probably know them. So the dialogue and the engagement is what's key. I think that includes sort of the high-level visits. It includes active embassies. You know very well what that can be like, how that can be challenging, and helping our partners, whatever government may be in power at any particular time, understand that our embassies are there regardless of our own administration, to engage and to represent America and the core values that we have, and to look for areas where we can cooperate in dealing with all of these challenges, whether it's migration, whether it's things like 5G and the Chinese challenge in that regard, or nuclear proliferation, counterterrorism, violent extremism. These are all things that we in 2019 have to deal with a very different set of challenges than what we were dealing with in 1919.
So energy diversification and independence continues to be a challenge for Central Europe. How do you see the progress on the 3 Cs initiative to promote kind of missing infrastructure, including energy, interconnections along Central and Eastern Europe? And what is the United States government doing to help support this?
Well, the 3 Cs is, I think, a very good initiative that we have embraced. It was initiated really by Poland, supported by Croatia, to take a look at how, by working together, countries in the region, Central Europe broadly, can deal with these issues. And energy diversification is a critical issue. You've all heard President Trump speak about it, but he wasn't the first one. The Obama administration was addressing this issue. To be energy dependent on Russia, as a number of countries have seen, is a strategic mistake. And what we have encouraged as friends, as allies, as partners, is that there be a focus on this, on how new infrastructure can be developed, new sources of energy can be developed, so that countries are not dependent on the whims of Vladimir Putin and his policies in whether you can turn on or off the lights. So 3 Cs, I think I just attended on Secretary Pompeo's behalf the ministerial meeting of the 3 Cs in Ljubljana just a few weeks ago. And I think they're making some great progress. There's a whole series of projects. They now have a sort of central funding source where money can be deposited by the participating countries to use for financing. And we're going to continue with it. The United States is not a member of this. We are an observer. But I think an important partner that all of the other countries are excited to see. And I think we've seen some interest from our Western European allies and colleagues who can also help make a difference in this. So energy diversification remains a major topic in any of the engagements we have with our Central European colleagues.
So what's your level of concern regarding increased Russian influence, malign influence within the region?
I think it's, my concern is fairly high, but I think we have to deal with this as we've always dealt with such challenges, pragmatically. We need to look back and understand the context and how this occurs. I do think we've spent several years, as we say, examining the problem, and now we're more and more looking at what we can do about it to counter Russian malign influence, disinformation. I think people are becoming more and more attuned to how Russia has done that. And I think we're speaking out with allies and being very frank when we're concerned, when the International Investment Bank is moving its headquarters to Budapest, which is long known as a front for Russian intelligence. Our concerns about that and the activities that may grow out of that are things we need to talk about and share with our friends and allies. And that's part of what our engagement is about.
So how much, in terms of this, serving in that area, I felt, during that time, because of migration crisis, because of high unemployment rates for some countries, because of this feeling that some were left out of globalization, maybe job adaptation wasn't in place. I felt like I had sort of a front row seat to the rise of hyper-nationalism. I heard a lot of rhetoric, as I traveled throughout certain countries in that region, about the need for sovereignty. For instance, in Hungary, Hungary is for Hungarians, and then top high-level officials would say we reject, multiculturalism. This is their position. Yet they're part of this global community and all of these multilateral organizations, and also in terms of encouraging foreign direct investment, you have that rhetoric that's kind of competing with this on the other side. You can have continue to lower your corporate tax rate, but that's going to have some sort of an impact on investment at some point. I'm a strong believer. Hungary is a very special country to me, which is why I continue to reference it, because I was the U.S. ambassador. It's in Central Europe here. But in terms of being the most secure and the most prosperous they possibly can be, sometimes all of that language and that kind of closing in and of the borders, with the idea of it's maintains their sovereignty, it concerns me sometimes, and I'm wondering sort of how you feel about that.
I think these are, again, the conversations we have to have. You become concerned about these issues. We certainly, as a nation, value diversity. That's what's made America, and we spread that story. And I think across Central Europe, it's a history of diversity. For those maybe younger, or those who actually have time to read books, I wanted to mention two particularly important volumes that I think help define my understanding of Central Europe, both in its context and today. One is John Lukac's Budapest 1900. It's obviously about Hungary, but it has overlays of the Central European experience in essence, and what made those countries as nation states. And then skipping ahead a little bit, when we contemplate the anniversary, the centennial of the end of World War I, and now this year, of course, as we look at the centennial of the Versailles Peace Treaty, is Paris 1919, Margaret Macmillan. It's about this thick, and when you look at my email inbox, you understand that I could probably never read a book like that again. So I'm glad I read it some years ago. Maybe that's what airplane rides are for. But I highly recommend that, because it's important to understand what the world that was created after the First World War. And even in those countries, they don't necessarily have a full understanding, and their efforts to shape that legacy. And I think with centennials coming up, it's important to pay a lot of attention to that, and we look at those opportunities.
So, in terms of what areas of cooperation do you feel might be underutilized? Could you highlight those for us?
I think people do underutilize NATO as a whole, and what the alliance offers in terms of opportunities for different activities. We have enormous numbers of training activities, which are a benefit not only in exercising potential defense plans. NATO, of course, is a defense alliance, but in helping our partners and allies, particularly those newer allies, in their own development. And our focus on burden sharing in the alliance, I think, really cuts right to that. Not only that we believe strongly that the United States, which continues to pay an enormous share of defense for NATO, but that we expect partners to live up to their commitments as well in that regard. We can use that more. The OSCE, I just came from the OSCE ministerial that Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Lajčák of Slovakia, the chairperson in office of OSCE this year, hosted in the High Tatras. And I was reminded sitting there of what a great institution that is. Complicated, so many members, you know, Russia on one side, difficult debates and discussions, but it's an institution that was created that has lots of room to use, and we should remember that. We plan to really do that. We have a wonderful new ambassador to the OSCE, former governor of Virginia, Gilmore. And Ambassador Gilmore is very engaged and very focused on using that as a platform to address concerns and issues, not always in a negative sense, of what we can do together to address these challenges throughout Central Europe and the broader region.
Great, super. Okay, I think it's time for Q&A. If anybody has any questions. Yes, sir?
Hello, I'm Borim Gojuli from Voice of America. Mr. Ambassador, how can Albania pass through the impasse political situation it has right now? And the second, what steps should Kosovo and Serbia take in order to finish what they started in 2011 with the dialogue?
Great questions, and I always have a bet with my staff that I can't get through a day without being asked about the Balkans. So I'm delighted to do it. I've spent a lot of my professional life and a lot of my personal feelings in the Balkans. Albania has been going through a tough period. Albania is a NATO ally. We worked very hard and very closely with Albania, which came through almost a unique experience as they emerged from the Hoxha era, which was a different experience than many others through the Cold War. The United States has been Albania's best friend, and we worked hard to help Albania on the path to NATO membership. And we're proud of that fact. We're proud of Albania, but I'm not proud of Albanians in recent weeks because they haven't been using the institutions that they have. You know, you cannot just boycott Parliament or give up your mandates. You've got to use those institutions. You've got to use your courts. You've got to appoint constitutional court justices to take your constitution and use those tools to get through difficult political times. So the United States is not going to, you know, arbitrate the domestic politics of Albania, but we're going to continue to encourage all sides there to work together with the institutions and make the necessary steps to get through. And if the institutions aren't working, then work to change them through the constitutional means that you have. I mean, I think it's always important to remember we, the United States, for our 230 odd years of independence and then as a unified country, you know, it took us a little while to get it just right too. It's a message I tell my EU friends all the time. We set out in our constitution to form a more perfect union. We never said it's done. We never said it's perfect. And so that union or any of our other partners need to think about that. But the institutions are what's key. And that's what will get them through that. Serbia and Kosovo similarly need to get back to the negotiating table. I spent a lot of time at that table with them. I think there's goodwill on both sides to find a way to reach resolution there and to bring much greater stability and prosperity to the whole of the Western Balkans. We've seen what happened in North Macedonia with courageous leadership working with courageous leaders from Greece to forge the Prespa agreement. It really should be a model of how intractable issues, questions that have plagued the region for, in some cases, more than centuries, can be resolved by people coming together, and with the support of the United States and the European Union, friends and allies, you can get through these challenges. So I would really encourage both the Kosovars and Serbia to figure out ways that they can come together. They'll have the full support of the United States, and I know our European partners in trying to move ahead through the dialogue process and other ways to find a full agreement. I know they can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Reeker. I'm Jovana Đurović from Serbian Service from the Voice of America, and want to directly relate to your last sentence, because this was my question. You half answered it in advance. So, as we have seen, we now have, it seems like we now have a stronger French initiative to resume the dialogue. French President Emmanuel Macron visited Serbia. He was there,
Yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday, right. So do you see that as a part of solution for resuming the dialogue? And do you see that the United States could have, like, let's say, more significant or more visible or stronger role in this resuming the dialogue? Because, as you said, the pause is too long. Thank you.
The United States is absolutely prepared to be engaged. In fact, I was talking to Secretary Pompeo about this morning. Our desire to see movement there, and the point is, we can't do it for you, and I mean you broadly. Kosovo and Serbia need to decide together that they are ready to get back to the dialogue table. We work very closely, of course, with our European partners and with the European Union. I was very involved in the early phase of the dialogue, which led to the Brussels Agreement, which I think has made a big difference over the last 5 years to the functioning of life, the pace and tempo of the remaining tensions in the region, and we can, through that process, get to a point where issues can be resolved, and that goes for other issues in the broader region too. Bosnia remains a situation, a country that has unresolved issues, and the international community can help there, but there needs to be a will and a demonstration of effort on the sides of the parties involved. Another VOA service, probably. I don't know.
Jeff Stacey, formerly of the State Department. Mr. Reeker, you spoke of principled engagement a few moments ago, and what you just said about Albania sounded very principled indeed. Regarding some of the others in the region, could you get into some more detail, perhaps, about the principles that you have in mind when some of us are struggling to understand how we're not sort of going a little easier on some of the key concerns to our own interests with regard to democracy, rule of law, corruption, etc.? Could you perhaps talk about how we're still getting things done? When you referenced the Secretary of State earlier, that also sort of reminded some of us of our engagement with the Saudis and others in that part of the world. So we're struggling to look for the consistency here and see how we're getting the interests of ourselves and our allies fully accomplished.
Well, my focus, of course, is Europe, and the focus of this is sort of Central Europe and our engagement there. The idea of principled engagement is that we have a set of principles and values which we espouse and talk about and encourage, particularly among friends and allies. Every situation is different and unique, and I think that's something to be kept in mind. I've learned over my 27 years in diplomacy that trying to always treat everything as exactly the same, it doesn't work, because each situation is by its own definition unique. That said, we can engage with countries who maybe are allies, and that means something. It does mean something to us, but we may have differences with them. And I liken it often to a family. We all have families with whom, members of our families with whom we will have differences at times. You go through good times, bad times, you have different perspectives, and the principled engagement there is that you can talk about those differences, and you can maybe agree to disagree in certain cases, but you can also, when it comes to diplomacy, make sure you make your points, talk about things we can do together, do that with a degree of respect, and also make sure that you're talking to a wide variety of people. If you're not engaging, if you're not going to these countries as diplomats and having meetings, not only with the high-level officials in various ministries, but also with representatives of civil society. When I was in Budapest recently, of course, I met with representatives of civil society, some people I've known for a long time, just to get their perspectives, to share our views, so that we can have a better understanding of how they see things. It's standard practice in diplomacy to meet with opposition parliamentarians as well as members of governments. And so we always try to do that. And that's certainly what we've undertaken in this past year, where we had a gap, a lack of real engagement with some of our Central European partners in particular. And the Secretary has set about to correct that. It doesn't mean that all of our differences of views or disagreements are resolved, and it does require a level of reciprocity. There is an expectation that if we're making the effort, we want to see the same type of good faith, honest, direct engagement from our partners as well.
Damon has a question.
Thank you, Phil, so much.
Extra credit.
One of the big things that changed from when we're celebrating all these anniversaries, NATO EU enlargement, China was sort of an irrelevant factor at the moment, and now China is a presence. In many cases, bringing needed investment. In other cases, what's the political sort of dynamic flowing from that? Can you just talk a little bit about your perspective about China's role in the region?
I think it's an evolving perspective for all of us. I think China is something, as we've talked about, Secretary Pompeo has said many times in the diplomatic context, that we also came to a realization later than we might have about how one engages with China. And what that engagement means. And what you have to realize as you step back is that China's engagement always has a strategic component. And engaging with China, whether you're engaging with a company or individuals, investors, you're actually engaging with the Chinese government. You're engaging with the Chinese Communist Party, ultimately. And you just have to keep that in perspective. This is the challenge with the Huawei issue when it comes to high-tech infrastructure and telecom infrastructure. It's not about finding back doors in code. They've walked right in the front door with this. And we do have a fundamentally different value set. It doesn't mean that we don't engage with China in many ways, many things, but what we've encouraged domestically is taking a hard look at this and the implications of that, and that's what we've encouraged our friends and allies to do as well. So China may arrive with cheap money, but what does that mean? What's the price of that money? It may seem like low interest loans, but what do you get afterwards? There are a lot of examples in Africa where this has been a challenge as well. So what we're doing is having conversations about this with our allies and partners, and I think across Europe, not just Central Europe, but in Western Europe, there's also a realization of the implications of this, and that we just need to be aware of what we're getting ourselves into.
Ambassador Reeker, Assistant Secretary Reeker, thank you very much for joining us here today. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks.